The apartment was sealed in foil. Inside, a man was broken, paranoid, obsessed with the idea that his mind was being controlled. It was the last silent scream of a genius mind destroying itself. And here was the cruelest irony. That man was once the Beatles' greatest rival. His name was Chris Curtis. He was more than just a drummer. He was the genius of the Searchers, the man behind Three Number, one hit, and the founding father of the legendary Deep Purple. He had it all. And then, at the height of his fame, he disappeared. This is not a story about music. This is the autopsy report of a psychological suicide. This is the tragedy of a man who fled the madness of fame, only to be swallowed by the madness within. Our story begins not in the spotlight, but in the shadow of war, and with a name. A name that was, in itself, a small, cruel joke of fate. He was born Christopher Crummy on August 26, 1941, and he wasn't born in Liverpool. He was born in Oldham, Lancashire. His family, a working-class couple, had been evacuated from their home in Liverpool to escape the relentless, terrifying bombing of the Nazi Blitz. The May Blitz of 1941 had been particularly horrific. A 7-night assault that leveled vast swathes of the city, killing thousands and leaving tens of thousands homeless. The port city of Liverpool, a vital artery for the war effort, was a primary target. This was Christopher's very first tragedy, a quiet one, but a profound one. From the moment he took his first breath, he was displaced. He was a refugee in his own country. This wasn't a philosophical concept, it was a physical reality. He was a Liverpudlian by blood, but an exile by birth. This sense of not quite belonging, of being an outsider, of having no stable roots, would become a phantom that chased him for his entire life. In 1945, with the war finally over, the Crummy family, like thousands of others, returned to the scarred but defiant city of Liverpool. They settled at 30 Florida Street in Bootle. This wasn't the romantic, bohemian Liverpool of the art students. Bootle was the heart of the docks, a tough, working-class, deeply scarred neighborhood. This is where Christopher grew up, surrounded by the ghosts of the war and the grit of the shipyard. And it's here that the first thread of fate was sown. At his primary school, St. Mary's, a young Christopher Crummy met a boy named Mike Pender. They were just children, running through the rubble-strewn streets, unaware that in a few short years, their names would be screamed by thousands of fans, their voices harmonizing on records that would define a generation. But first, there was the name, Crummy. In the cruel, simple, and brutally honest world of the schoolyard, a name that sounds like crummy is a target. It was a constant, low-level humiliation. It was an anchor, a daily reminder that he was perhaps less than. This, combined with his outsider status as a boy from Oldham, began to forge an insecurity, an invisible weight that he would carry for years. He was a boy who felt from day one that he had something to prove. Christopher, however, was sharp, incredibly sharp. While his peers were destined for the docks or the factories, Christopher did something remarkable. He passed his 11+ exam. In the rigid class-based system of 1950s, Britain, the 11+ was a single test that decided your entire future. If you passed, you went to a grammar school, an academic institution designed to create professionals, doctors, lawyers, teachers. If you failed, you went to a secondary modern, a school designed to create factory workers and laborers. Christopher passed. This was a life-changing fork in the road. It immediately separated him from his working-class roots, from boys like Mike Pender. He was sent to the prestigious St. Mary's College in Crosby, a strict, devout Catholic grammar school. And it was here, at St. Mary's, that the great defining conflict of his life truly began. It was a war fought inside his own head, order versus chaos. His world of order was the school and the church. St. Mary's was all about discipline, tradition, and reverence. It was a world of Latin verbs, pressed uniforms, and the absolute authority of the priests. And Christopher surprisingly excelled in this world. He was a deeply, genuinely devout Roman Catholic. He found a profound beauty and comfort in the structure, the ritual, the ancient history. He sang in the church choir, and it was here he first learned about harmony. His high, clear voice would soar in the Gregorian chants and the complex polyphonic hymns. The church was his first sanctuary, a place of perfect mathematical divine order. But outside the stone walls of the school, a new world was exploding, a world of pure, unadulterated chaos. On the radio, broadcasting from distant, godless America, he heard the electrifying, forbidden sounds of rock and roll, Fats Domino, Little Richard. He heard raw American gospel and R&B. This wasn't the polite, structured harmony of the church choir. This was the sound of sweat, of freedom, of raw, unfiltered emotion. It was the sound of a world beyond the rigid pews and the disapproving eyes of the priests. This internal war was raging. Was he the good Catholic choir boy or the rebellious rock and roller? The truth was, he was both. And that fundamental contradiction, the craving for both divine order and human chaos, would one day tear him apart. The conflict wasn't just in his head, it was in his home. His father, a conservative, working-class man, was baffled by his grammar school son. He wanted him to have a stable job, to use the education he had been given. Music, this loud American noise, was frivolous. It was a distraction. The family battles over music became legendary. The school forced Christopher to learn the violin, a proper instrument of the orchestra. Christopher, in defiance, demanded to play the double bass, the backbone of skiffle and rockabilly. His father, in a reluctant concession to his son's obsession, eventually bought him a drum set in the late 1950s. But the pressure was always there. After graduating from St. Mary's, Christopher found himself in a kind of soul-crushing purgatory. He wasn't at university. He wasn't a full-time musician. He was working at Swift's furniture store on Stanley Road selling prams. Can you imagine the humiliation, the sheer teeth-grinding frustration? This brilliant, hyperactive boy, his head filled with the thunder of R&B, the complex harmonies of the church, and the intricate rhythms he was teaching himself on his drums and the family piano, was spending his days discussing the wheelbase of a baby carriage with expectant mothers. This was his father's stable job. The pressure built and his anti-conformist streak exploded. In an act of pure visual defiance, he grew his hair long. In the late 1950s, this wasn't a fashion choice. It was a political statement. It was a two-fingered salute to the world of stable jobs, short back and sides, and suburban conformity. He was mocked for it, of course. His odd, hyperactive behavior became more pronounced. He spoke in rapid-fire bursts, his mind clearly working faster than his mouth. He was obsessive. He was intense. He was different. Years later, his friend George Harrison would affectionately nickname him Mad Henry. But the signs were already there. He was an oddity. Friends and family noted his frantic energy, his strange obsessions, his inability to be still. Looking back with the tragic clarity of hindsight, many now speculate these were the first undiagnosed signs of a deeper mental health issue, perhaps bipolar disorder. He wasn't poor, not like some of his Merseybeat peers. His was a tragedy of the mind. He was a misfit from a good home, a boy with a crummy name who secretly dreamed of being a star. He was a walking time bomb of talent, faith, and frustration, working in a pram shop, just waiting for a spark. In 1960, the fuse was finally lit. Chris, now 19, was still working at the pram shop, but his nights were spent playing drums, honing his craft. He ran into his old primary school friend Mike Pender. Pender, who had failed the 11 plus, had taken the other path. He was a working musician playing in a skiffle group started by a man named John McNally. The group was called The Searchers, named after the classic 1956 John Wayne Western. Their drummer, Norman McGarry, had just left to join another promising local band, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. The Searchers needed someone, and fast. Chris, with his frantic energy, his secret love of R&B, and his polished, powerful drumming, was the perfect fit. He quit the pram shop. The stable job was dead. The rebellion had won. The lineup was set. John McNally on guitar, Mike Pender on guitar and vocals, Tony Jackson on bass and vocals, and Chris Crummy on drums and vocals. The first order of business before they played a single gig was that name. Crummy. It wouldn't work. It was an anchor, a schoolyard taunt, a reminder of the insecurity he was trying to shed. Tony Jackson, their charismatic bassist, suggested a change. There was another local act making waves named Lee Curtis. It sounded sharp, American, professional. How about Chris Curtis? It was perfect. In that single moment, Christopher Crummy, the crummy boy from Bootle, the displaced evacuee, the frustrated pram salesman, the disobedient son, died. And Chris Curtis, the star, the artist, the rebel, the visionary, was born. It was an act of profound self-creation. It was a suit of armor, a mask he would wear as he charged into the chaos. He was no longer the boy who was given a name. He was the man who chose one. The band's proving ground, as it was for the Beatles, was Hamburg, Germany. The Star Club. This wasn't a gig. It was a crucible. It was a brutal, non-stop human marathon. The Searchers, like their rivals, were forced to play for hours on end, 7, 8, sometimes 9 hours a night. They played to a volatile, dangerous crowd of sailors, gangsters, prostitutes, and speed-addicted locals. This is where Chris Curtis, the mad genius, truly took over. He wasn't just a drummer sitting in the back keeping time. He was, without question, the band's creative director. He was their arranger. While the rest of the band was sleeping or drinking, Chris was hunting. He was obsessive. He would spend his daylight hours in Hamburg's record shops. But his real treasure trove was back in Liverpool. He still had his connections at Brian Epstein's NEMS record shop. Epstein, at this point, was just a well-dressed upper-class man who ran a posh music store, not yet the kingmaker of the Fab Four. Chris would spend his lunch breaks from his old job digging through the import bins, searching for obscure American B-sides. He was a musical archaeologist. He wasn't interested in the hits everyone knew. He was looking for the hidden gems, the soulful B-sides by the Drifters, the deep cuts from Elvis, the obscure gospel tracks. He brought these songs to the band like a prospector panning for gold. He taught them the intricate, high-pitched harmonies he'd learned in the St. Mary's Church Choir. He had a vision for their sound. He took Tony Jackson's naturally high voice and blended his own distinctive top harmony over it, creating a shimmering, angelic, and utterly unique vocal blend that no other band had. And he attacked his drum kit. He wasn't content with just a snare and kick drum. He introduced a wild variety of percussion, tom-toms, castanets, bongos, cowbells. He was layering, texturing the music. He was in essence a producer, a songwriter, and an arranger, all from behind the drum kit. He was the engine. He was the sound. But Hamburg demanded a terrible price. To stay awake, to perform with that hyper energy for 8 hours a night, Chris and the others turned to the club's drug of choice, amphetamines, preludin, speed. It wasn't recreational, not at first. It was a tool for survival. It was medicine for an impossible job. But for Chris, a man already wired for intensity, it was like pouring gasoline on an open flame. It was the beginning of a chemical dependency, a pattern of using pills to manage his reality, a pattern that would, in just a few short years, escalate to LSD and his ultimate destruction. And through it all, Chris Curtis lived his bizarre secret double life. The devout Catholic boy was still in there, trapped inside the speed-fueled rock and roller. The band's biographer, Spencer Lee, tells an almost unbelievable story. After a Saturday night playing a marathon set at the Star Club, drenched in sweat, his ears ringing, his blood buzzing with amphetamines, Chris would quietly slip away. He would walk to a local convent on Sunday morning and attend Mass. He was desperately trying to balance the scales. He was hiding his faith from his bandmates, trying to fit the Beat Boy image, while simultaneously praying for his own soul. He was a paradox, a speed-fueled, R&B-obsessed drummer who was secretly, desperately, trying to stay clean in the eyes of God. The pressure was mounting. The cracks were forming. The rivalry with the Beatles was palpable. They played the same clubs, often on the same bill. The Searchers would watch the Beatles, and the Beatles would watch the Searchers. Chris became friendly with John Lennon and George Harrison. It was this Mad Henry energy, this frantic, brilliant, and slightly unhinged charisma that they were drawn to. But it was a friendly rivalry with a sharp, competitive edge. The pressure to outperform them was immense. Chris, never one to mince words, made enemies. He infamously antagonized the Cavern Club's owner, Ray McFall, by publicly calling the legendary venue dreadful, stinky, and sweaty. It got them occasionally banned. This was Chris Curtis, a genius, an abrasive, uncompromising visionary who didn't care who he offended. By 1962, they had survived Hamburg. They had been forged in the fire. They were a honed, professional, and utterly unique machine. They were about to return to Liverpool, a city that was itself about to explode. Chris Curtis, the mad genius who had escaped the name Crummy, was in complete control for now. But the seeds of his destruction, the drugs, the madness, the warring internal conflicts of faith and frenzy, had been firmly and fatally planted. They had survived Hamburg. But returning to Liverpool in 1962, the Searchers were not the same boys who had left. They were veterans, forged in a crucible of sleepless nights, amphetamines, and relentless, demanding crowds. They had left as a covers band. They returned as a machine. And Chris Curtis, armed with his bag of obscure American B-sides and his Mad Henry energy, was about to douse it in gasoline. This was the dawn of the Merseybeat boom. The local music paper, Merseybeat, was chronicling the rise of a new sound. The Cavern Club, the Iron Door, the Litherland Town Hall, these weren't just venues, they were launch pads. And while the Beatles were quickly becoming the undisputed kings of the local scene, every major record label in London was sending A&R men north, scrambling to find the next Beatles. The Searchers didn't have to wait long. Their reputation as a live act, their relentless energy, their intricate harmonies, and their obscure, brilliant songbook made them the hottest unsigned ticket in town. While the Beatles had secured a deal with the monolithic EMI, the Searchers were snapped up by Pi Records. Their champion was Tony Hatch, a sharp, ambitious producer who, unlike the more classical George Martin, was a pure pop songwriter. He saw in the Searchers what he saw in the Beatles, a self-contained unit that was raw, charismatic, and, most importantly, marketable. In 1963, they were rushed into the studio. The clock was ticking. The Mersey beat sound was a fad, and they needed to strike while the iron was hot. For their first single, the band debated, should they record one of their few raw originals, Number? Chris Curtis reached into his deep, seemingly bottomless bag of American B-sides. He pulled out a gem, a soulful, catchy, and relatively unknown track by the Drifters. It was called Sweets for My Sweet. It shot to number 1 in August of 1963. Let's pause and understand what this meant. This was their first single. In a time when the Beatles themselves were just finding their footing, the Searchers had come from nowhere and planted their flag firmly at the top of the mountain. Overnight, Chris Curtis, the boy named Crummy, the 22-year-old former pram salesman, was a household name. He was a pop star. Every ounce of his frustration, his Mad Henry energy, his obsessive crate-digging passion had been validated. He had been right. His taste, his arrangements, his vision was a success. But success in the 1960s pop world was a ravenous beast, and it needed to be fed. Pie Records and Tony Hatch were ecstatic, but they were also terrified of losing momentum. They needed a follow-up, and fast. Hatch, being a professional songwriter, saw a formula. The high harmonies, the driving beat, the sweet melodic hook. So instead of trusting Chris to find another obscure gem, Tony Hatch wrote them a song. It was called Sugar and Spice. It was a hit. It shot to number 2 in November 1963. But to Chris Curtis, it was a compromise. It was a clone. This wasn't the raw R&B he loved. This wasn't the authentic soul he had found in those dusty record bins. This was manufacturing. This was the first crack in the armor. This was the beginning of his internal war with the very machine he had helped to build. He was already feeling the tension between his mad genius and the industry's demand for repeatable, sellable order. He was furious. He was the creative leader, yet he was being handed songs by a producer in a suit. He vowed that for their next single, he would be the one to choose. So, for their third release, he dug deep. He pulled out another track from his collection, a haunting minor key ballad written by an American songwriter he admired, Jackie DeShannon. It was a song of jealousy, paranoia, and pain. A far cry from the sugary sweet lyrics of their first 2 hits. It was called Needles and Pins. This was the one. This was the sound that changed everything. The band, particularly Mike Pender and John McNally, perfected that opening riff. It was played on a 12-string Rickenbacker guitar, an instrument that was still rare and exotic. That shimmering, chiming, almost celestial jangle. That was the sound of the future. This wasn't just another hit. This was a lightning bolt. Needles and Pins was a global smash. It hit number 1 in the UK in February 1964. It was a massive hit across Europe, and crucially, it cracked America. But its influence went far beyond the charts. In a garage in Los Angeles, a group of folk musicians named the Byrds heard that sound. Roger McGuinn was captivated by that 12-string jangle, a sound he would merge with Bob Dylan's lyrics to create folk rock. Years later, a young man in Florida named Tom Petty would hear both the Searchers and the Byrds, and that chiming riff would become the entire foundation of his musical DNA, most notably on his 1978 hit, Listen to Her Heart. That entire lineage, that entire genre, that sound that echoes through decades of rock music was ignited by Chris Curtis, the mad genius from Liverpool, who had the taste and the audacity to fight his record label. He had won. He had proven definitively that his vision was more powerful than their formula. 1964 was the year of the Searchers. They were on fire. They were unstoppable. After Needles and Pins, they released Don't Throw Your Love Away. Number 1. That was it. 3 number 1 hits in less than a year. Let's put this in perspective. In 1964, the Beatles were, of course, dominating the world, but the Searchers were right there with them. They were part of the same Fab Four, the original wave of the British invasion. They toured America. They toured Australia. Chris Curtis, the boy named Crummy, was a global superstar, his face on lunchboxes, his voice on every radio on the planet. The hits kept coming. When You Walk in the Room was a flawless chiming masterpiece that hit number 3. They showed their range with What Have They Done to the Rain?, a haunting anti-nuclear protest song by Malvina Reynolds. This was pure folk rock, recorded before the Byrds had even released Mr. Tambourine Man. Chris and the Searchers were not just part of the trend. They were creating it. Chris was, by all accounts, the band's creative and spiritual leader. He was the one who wrote most of their original B-sides, songs like He's Got No Love and I Pretend I'm With You. He was the arranger, the tastemaker. He led the vocals on their powerful cover of Stand By Me. His Mad Henry energy on stage, a whirlwind of hair and drumsticks, was the band's visual focus. He was the social link to the other gods of the scene. He was genuinely friends with John Lennon and George Harrison. George, in particular, was fascinated by Chris's frantic, brilliant, and slightly unhinged charisma. It was Harrison who lovingly nicknamed him Mad Henry. John Lennon, who loved chaos, was equally indulgent. Chris was the court jester in the new kingdom of Mersey Beat royalty. He was at the absolute dizzying pinnacle of his life. He had the respect of his peers, the adoration of millions, and a string of #1 hits to his name. But the machine that builds you is also the machine that grinds you down. And the Mad Henry persona, the one everyone found so charming, was being fueled by something dark. The pressure was inhuman. The drudgery, as Chris would later call it, of the tour record tour cycle was relentless. It was a nonstop conveyor belt. As soon as one tour ended, they were rushed into the studio to record the next single, which Pi Records demanded be a hit. Then a quick photo shoot, a few TV appearances, and back on a plane to America, or Australia, or Hong Kong. The amphetamines, the Preludin, that had been a survival tool in Hamburg, were now a basic food group. They were no longer just for staying awake for an 8-hour gig. They were for maintenance. This was the chemical curse of the 1960s. There was no downtime. There was no therapy. There was only the pill, a pill to get you up for the 6 a.m. flight, a pill to make you sparkle for the TV cameras, a pill to calm you down after the adrenaline of the show, and, inevitably, a pill to knock you out so you could get 3 hours of sleep before doing it all again. Chris, the man with the Mad Henry mind, the man whose brain was already a high-performance engine, was now force-feeding that engine pure, high-octane rocket fuel. And the engine was beginning to overheat. The internal war was fracturing the band. The success of Needles and Pins had become a golden cage. Pi Records and Tony Hatch wanted more of that chiming 12-string sound. The rest of the band, John, Mike, and Tony, were happy to oblige. It was a formula. It paid for their houses, their cars. Why mess with it? But Chris, the artist, was bored. He was creatively suffocated. He wanted to push forward. He wanted to record the raw, authentic R&B he loved. He wanted to record his own songs, but the band and the label kept forcing him to play the hits. This is the great tragic irony of Chris Curtis. He was being force-fed the very sound he himself had created. He had built his own prison. He was the creative leader, but he was not the band leader. He was the drummer. He didn't have the final say. McNally and Jackson were the founders. This power struggle, the visionary who doesn't have the corporate power, began to eat away at him. He became more erratic, more argumentative, more unreliable. He was trapped. And when you're trapped, you look for a new door. Sometime in 1965, at the absolute height of their fame, Chris Curtis was introduced to a new drug. It wasn't an upper like speed. It wasn't a downer like a sleeping pill. It was something else entirely. A key, a window, a chemical that promised to unlock the universe. He began experimenting with LSD. For a mind like his, a mind already prone to hyperactivity, a mind already struggling with the profound spiritual conflict between the Catholic Church and the rock and roll lifestyle. LSD was not a door to perception. It was a stick of dynamite. The paranoia, which had always been a quiet hum beneath his insecurity, now had a microphone. He began to see shadows. He became suspicious. He met a girlfriend in Hamburg, Annette Kunze, a photographer, who returned to Liverpool with him. She was the one responsible for their iconic, sullen, moody look on their album sleeves. A sharp contrast to the smiling, mop-top Beatles. But was that look just fashion? Or was it a reflection of their genuine, bone-deep exhaustion? Was it a reflection of Chris's growing suspicion of the world around him? The Mad Henry nickname was no longer charming. It was becoming a diagnosis. And yet the genius was still firing. In 1965, they released Goodbye My Love, another massive hit, a powerful dark ballad. They were at the absolute apex. They were global superstars. Chris Curtis was on top of the world. He was 24 years old. He had achieved everything he had ever dreamed of. He had vanquished the name Crummy forever. But the man who had craved order and chaos his entire life was now being consumed by them. The order of his faith was being drowned out by the chaos of his fame. The order of the pop charts was suffocating the chaos of his creativity. He was trapped. He was the most successful version of himself, and he had never been more miserable. The man everyone loved as Mad Henry was in secret beginning to go truly, terrifyingly mad. 1966 was coming, and the great bright fire that was Chris Curtis was about to burn itself out in a final spectacular and tragic explosion. The internal pressure was unsustainable. The machine was rattling, shaking itself to pieces. In 1966, the band would embark on its most ambitious tour yet, sharing the bill with the Rolling Stones. And that pressure, which had been building in his mind, was about to become a spectacular public and career-ending collapse. 1966. This was the year the wave broke. This was the year the bill for 3 nonstop years of fame, amphetamines, and sleepless nights finally came due. The Searchers, still one of the biggest bands in the world, embarked on a grueling, make-or-break international tour. Their itinerary was punishing. The Philippines, Hong Kong, and a major tour of Australia, where they would be sharing the bill with another band at the peak of its powers, the Rolling Stones. This should have been the pinnacle, a triumphant lap of the globe. Instead, it was a death march, and Chris Curtis was its first casualty. He was, by this point, a man teetering on the edge of a precipice. The Mad Henry persona, which had once been a charming, energetic quirk fueled by speed, was now a frightening, unpredictable mask for a mind fractured by LSD and profound exhaustion. The band, his brothers, could no longer rely on him. He was becoming a liability. The man who had been the band's engine was now sand in the gears. The climax happened in Australia. The details are hazy, blurred by the fog of rock and roll myth, but the result is stark. During one of the shows, Chris Curtis, the heartbeat of the Searchers, the man whose energy had propelled them to superstardom, was so profoundly intoxicated, so lost in his own chemical haze that he literally fell off the stage. This was not a rock and roll antic, like Keith Moon kicking over his drum kit. This was a humiliating, terrifying, and very public collapse. This was a man disintegrating in front of an audience. For the rest of the band, McNally, Pender, and Jackson, this was the final straw. It was one thing to deal with an artistic temperament. It was another to deal with a bandmate who was professionally, physically, and mentally imploding. The confrontations backstage were brutal. They were exhausted by his unreliability, his paranoid accusations, his increasingly bizarre behavior. According to band lore, they discovered his empty stash of pills. The mad genius was no longer a genius. He was just mad. The trust that holds a band together, the unspoken brotherhood, was shattered. In the spring of 1966, somewhere in the middle of this nightmarish tour, it all ended. Chris Curtis quit, or was pushed out. The stories are blurred by time, tragedy, and legal papers. The distinction hardly matters. He was 25 years old. He flew home to England alone. He left the band to hire a replacement, a session drummer named Johnny Blunt, just to fulfill their contractual obligations. The Searchers, the band Chris had built, the band whose sound he had invented in his head, would continue without him. Their greatest success was now firmly behind them, but they would carry on, a ghost of the band Chris had created, performing his arrangements, his hits, while he was gone. Chris Curtis, the man who had 3 number-1 hits, the man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with the Beatles and the Stones, was unemployed. He was a pariah. His career was, for all intents and purposes, over. The Mad Henry energy that had fueled his rise had now become the paranoia that guaranteed his fall. He was back in England, a failure in his own eyes, his mind fractured by LSD, his future a terrifying blank and silent void. But the genius inside Chris Curtis did not die. It just became stranger and more dangerous. He did not crawl back to his parents' house in Liverpool. Not yet. He was still Chris Curtis, a name that still opened doors in the new, hip-swinging London. He moved into a flat and, fueled by a chaotic mix of desperation and a still-firing creative mind, he attempted a comeback. He would be a solo artist, a producer. He was still a face on the scene. He was still the Mad Henry. The Beatles had known. He was still the man who had the hits. He immediately went into the studio to record a solo single. It was a cover of a song by an American artist named Joe South, a track called Aggravation. The title, given what he'd just been through, is almost painfully ironic. And look who he pulled in for the session. He was still a somebody. The session musicians backing him up included some of London's hottest, most in-demand players, a young razor-sharp guitarist named Jimmy Page, and a virtuosic unknown bassist named John Paul Jones. Think about that. He is once again in the room with future gods. The nucleus of Led Zeppelin is his backing band. This is the level of respect his talent still commanded. The single, despite its pedigree, flopped in the UK. It was a minor hit in Sweden, but in England, it was dead on arrival. The Merseybeat sound he had championed was already ancient history. Psychedelia, the very thing that was scrambling his brain, was the new sound, and his single sounded dated. But Chris wasn't just a performer. He was a producer. He had an incredible ear. In a flurry of activity, he produced the legendary Ready, Steady, Go TV special for the one and only Otis Redding, a booking that solidified his reputation as a man of immaculate R&B taste. He also co-wrote and produced hits for the pop duo Paul and Barry Ryan, including Nighttime. He was still in the game. He was hustling. He was connecting. He was moving in the elite circles of London's new musical aristocracy. And it was at a party thrown by one of his new business partners, Tony Edwards, that he met a gifted, classically trained Hammond organist named John Lord. The two became fast friends. John Lord was fascinated by Chris's mad energy, his encyclopedic knowledge of music, and his wild, conceptual ideas. They decided to become flatmates, And it was in that flat in the haze of 1967 that Chris Curtis had his last, and arguably his most brilliant, idea. He had an idea for a new kind of band, a supergroup, but not a fixed group like Cream, something different. He called his concept Roundabout. The idea was a central revolving core of musicians, a musical roundabout where members could get on and off at will, allowing different virtuosos to come in, play, and then leave while the core, the engine, remained. The engine, in Chris's mind, would be him, the visionary. He would be the producer, the drummer, the conceptualist. He would be the ringmaster. His flatmate, John Lord, with his earth-shaking Hammond organ sound, would be the first permanent member. They had a manager, Tony Edwards. All they needed was a guitarist. Chris knew exactly who to get. He reached back into his past to the raw, wild days in the Hamburg clubs. He remembered a phenomenally talented, dangerously intense English guitarist who had been playing in Germany, a man named Ritchie Blackmore. Chris, John, and Tony tracked Blackmore down and convinced him to come back to England for this new project. The core was set. Curtis, Lord, Blackmore. This was it. This was his comeback. This was his creation. It was more ambitious than the Searchers, more musically advanced. This was the future. And then the internal noise that he had been medicating for years, the paranoia that had been scratching at the walls, finally and spectacularly took over. The LSD had done its work. His mind, the brilliant, complex machine that had processed church harmonies, R&B rhythms, and pop hooks, was now hopelessly cross-wired. He was no longer just eccentric. He was ill. The most famous and most tragic story of Chris Curtis's life is about to happen. The story that, for decades, was whispered as a dark joke in the music industry. John Lord and the manager, Tony Edwards, arrived at the flat they shared with Chris. Chris wasn't there, but his madness was. Chris, in the depths of a profound LSD-induced psychosis, had covered the entire apartment in aluminum foil. Every last inch, the walls, the windows, the ceiling, the furniture. He was convinced in his fractured mind that someone, possibly his own manager, Tony Edwards, was beaming bad vibes or controlling rays into the flat, trying to steal his ideas, trying to control his mind. The foil, he believed, was a shield. It was a desperate tinfoil hat defense against a world that had become a terrifying, hostile force. This is not rock and roll mythology. This is a documented fact. John Lord and Tony Edwards walked into that flat and were confronted with the terrifying, glittering physical evidence of their partner's complete mental breakdown. This wasn't charming eccentricity. This wasn't Mad Henry. This was profound, terrifying illness. The decision was immediate and brutal. This was not a man you could build a band around. This was not a man you could sign a contract with. This was a man who needed help. The roundabout concept, his brilliant idea, continued woe without him. He was gently, or perhaps not so gently, pushed out of his own creation. The managers, Lord and Blackmore, kept the concept, kept the band, and simply removed the inconvenient, insane founder. The band he had conceived, the band featuring the musicians he had assembled, evolved. They found a singer and a bassist, and they changed their name. The name they chose was Deep Purple, a name that Chris Curtis himself had suggested. It was the title of his grandmother's favorite song. And in a final devastating cosmic twist of irony, what was Deep Purple's first massive international breakthrough hit? A cover of a song called Hush. The original artist? Joe South. The exact same songwriter Chris had covered for his failed Aggravation single. The songwriter he had championed. He had handed them the blueprint. He had handed them the musicians. He had handed them the name. He had even handed them the source material for their first hit. And his own fractured mind had locked him out of the control room. He had lost everything. The Searchers, his solo career, and now Deep Purple. There was nothing left to lose. The mad genius had been declared bankrupt. The rock and roll world was finished with him, and he, in turn, was finished with it. The fall was now complete. In 1969, at the age of 28, Chris Curtis, the pop star with 3 number-1 hits, the Mad Henry who palled around with the Beatles, the visionary who had invented Deep Purple, did the most shocking and unexpected thing of all. He vanished. He quit music. He quit London. He fled the entire life he had built. He ran away from Chris Curtis. He moved back to Liverpool to his parents' home. He cut his trademark long hair, and he became, once again, Christopher Crummy. And he got a stable job. He joined the Inland Revenue. Chris Curtis became a civil servant, a tax collector. Let that sink in. This is not an exaggeration. This is what happened. For the next 19 years, the man whose voice and drums had defined the entire Mersey beat sound, the man whose creative DNA is in Deep Purple and Tom Petty, spent his days in a quiet, anonymous office, processing tax forms. It was the ultimate hiding place. It was the act of a man so traumatized, so broken by the chaos of his own genius, that he ran to the most profound, most mundane, most boring form of order he could possibly find: British bureaucracy. He had fled the absolute chaos of his rock and roll life, a life where he was paranoid. His manager was beaming rays at him for a life of spreadsheets, filing cabinets, and pension plans. He was no longer Chris Curtis, the star. He was once again just Christopher Crummy, the man with the stable job his father had always wanted for him. The rebellion was over. The rebellion had lost. He was, by all accounts, good at his job. He was, after all, a brilliant man who had passed his 11 plus. He later said in a rare interview that he actually liked his colleagues. He found a simple human stability in the routine. No one was trying to control his mind. No one was feeding him pills. No one was screaming his name. He had found a refuge, but the star was still in there, buried deep. The music historian and writer Spencer Lee, who later tracked him down and befriended him in the late 1990s, told a heartbreaking story. Chris, the tax collector, would be in his local supermarket pushing a trolley buying milk and bread, and occasionally, just occasionally, a fan from the old days, someone who had been a teenager in 1964, would look at this quiet, middle-aged man and see the ghost. They would approach him hesitantly. "Excuse me, are you Chris Curtis from the Searchers?" And Chris, for a brief, fleeting moment, would light up. He would be delighted. The Mad Henry would peek out from behind the tax forms, just for a second, overjoyed to know that he hadn't been completely, totally forgotten. For nearly 30 years, he gave almost no interviews. He was a ghost, haunting the aisles of his local supermarket. He was the most famous invisible man in Liverpool. He retired early from the Inland Revenue in 1988 due to a systemic illness. Some reports call it sick building syndrome from the dust and poor ventilation in the old tax office. Others, more grimly, suspect it was the long, delayed bill for the chemical excesses of the 1960s finally coming due. He was 47 years old. His career as a star had lasted 6 years. His career as a tax collector had lasted 19. And now he was simply retired. A ghost in the machine, waiting for the end. The vanishing act was complete. For 19 years, Christopher Crummy, the tax collector, had successfully hidden from the ghost of Chris Curtis, the star. He had traded the chaos of fame for the absolute numbing order of bureaucracy. When he retired in 1988 at 47, due to a mysterious systemic illness, he was a man twice retired, first from superstardom, then from civil service. He was now, for the first time in his life, simply a man. A man with no job title, no band, and no mask. A man in his late 40s, living a quiet life in Aintree, Liverpool, with his health failing, his past a locked box, and his future a question mark. What does a ghost do when it finally stops running? He returns to his beginnings. He searches for the one thing that was real before the chaos began. He returns to the order. In the 1990s, Christopher Crummy, the boy who had sung in the strict Catholic choir at St. Mary's College, found his way back to the church. He became an active, beloved parishioner at the Holy Rosary Church in Sefton. But this is where the story, in its final poignant chapter, gets so incredibly beautiful. He didn't just return to the pews to pray for his sins. He didn't just become another voice in the traditional choir. He took over. Chris, the man who had arranged needles and pins, the man who had envisioned Deep Purple, couldn't just sit there. His mad genius was still firing, but it was no longer fueled by paranoia and speed. It was fueled by something else, faith. He started a new music group within the church, and they didn't just sing old dusty hymns. Chris, in a final brilliant act of synthesis, brought his two warring worlds together. He led the group in singing folk music and rock and roll. This is the key. This is the moment the paradox of his entire life was finally solved. The devout Catholic and the rock and roll rebel were no longer at war. The boy who had fled the Star Club to attend Sunday Mass was now bringing the music of the Star Club into the Mass. He was using the devil's music to serve God. He was using his rock and roll talents to attract the local youth, to bring new energy to the ancient rituals he loved. The two halves of his soul, order and chaos, had finally made peace. He was, at last, whole. And then, having made peace with his order, he found a new, gentle way to embrace his chaos. On weeknights, this quiet, graying, retired civil servant, this devout church music leader, would go to his local pubs, places like Cooper's Emporium and the Old Roan Pub, and he would do karaoke. Let that sink in. The man who had 3 number-1 hits, the man whose voice had been broadcast across the globe, the man who had played on Ready, Steady, Go and toured with the Rolling Stones, was now getting up in a small, local pub after a few pints to sing R&B classics on a cheap microphone over a synthesized backing track. This is the vanishing act in its most profound and most heartbreaking form. He was hiding in plain sight. The other regulars, the younger audience, had no idea. They had no idea that the quiet, unassuming man in the corner, Chris, who was singing a flawless, soulful, spine-chilling version of Stand By Me or some obscure Drifters track, was the man who had led the vocals on the Searchers version. They just thought, that old Chris bloke, he's a bit odd, but bloody hell, he can sing. This was his new stage, a tiny, humble stage, but it was his. He wasn't being forced to play Sugar and Spice by a record executive. He wasn't being heckled by sailors in Hamburg. He wasn't having his creativity suffocated by his bandmates. He was in total control. He was finally free. He was no longer Chris Curtis, the star. He was just Chris, the local, who was surprisingly good at karaoke, and this might have been how the story ended. A quiet, anonymous, but peaceful fade to black. A secret genius, living out his days in the pubs and pews of Liverpool. But the past, the world, was not quite finished with him. In 1998, a man named Spencer Lee, a respected BBC Radio Merseyside host and music historian, finally tracked him down. For almost 30 years, Chris Curtis had been a ghost. He was the great lost mystery of the Mersey Beat-Era. Whatever happened to Chris Curtis was a question whispered by rock historians and obsessive fans for decades. And now, for the first time in 3 decades, Chris agreed to talk. He was 57 years old. He was ill. And perhaps he knew that time was running out. Perhaps he, the man who had been defined by rumor, the drugs, the foil-covered flat, the madness, wanted to set the record straight. The Mad Henry peeked out from behind the tax forms. The voice from the silence began to speak. He was witty, he was sharp, he was candid. He talked about the drudgery of the touring. He talked about the genius of his bandmates and the frustrations. He talked about the music. And the world began to remember. In 2003, as record labels began digging into their vaults, new, high-quality reissues of the Searchers material began to appear. The Iron Door sessions, the Star Club tapes, the Swedish radio sessions. And the producers, needing liner notes, needing context, went to the source. They went to Chris. And he was happy to talk. He was finally being acknowledged, not as the madman, but as the architect. He was, in his final years, becoming the historian of his own lost time. This quiet, late-life renaissance was a blessing. Tribute articles began to appear. New reissues of unreleased tracks from their 1960s sessions and new documentary footage began to re-examine his crucial, underrated role. The world was finally catching up to what his friends, like George Harrison, had known all along. This man was a genuine, bona fide, one-of-a-kind genius. He even began to perform in a very low-key way for a local musicians' charity called Mersey Cats in Highton. He would be driven there by a cousin of Mike Pender, another thread from his old life. But he was careful. He avoided the old hits. He didn't want to become a nostalgia act. He was still protecting himself. But the body that had endured the amphetamines of the 60s, the systemic illness of the 80s, and the stress of a lifetime of internal conflict was failing. The rumors about his health had swirled for decades. Was it permanent paranoia from the LSD? Was it undiagnosed bipolar disorder or schizophrenia? Was it a heart condition? We will never truly know. The madness was his cross to bear, a private internal noise that, unlike the crowds, he could never escape. On February 28, 2005, Christopher Crummy, the man the world knew as Chris Curtis, was found dead at his home. He had died alone. He was 63 years old. There was no fanfare. There was no rock star funeral. It was a quiet, lonely, almost anonymous end for a man whose life had been so incredibly, deafeningly loud. The displaced boy who was born an evacuee in 1941, the outsider who never quite fit in, died in the end by himself. He was surrounded by his music, his memories, and the ghosts of his past, but he was alone. The final accounting of Chris Curtis's life is a study in contrasts. How do we remember this brilliant, tragic, mad genius? His contribution is immeasurable. He was the man who brought those intricate, soaring, gospel-infused harmonies into the Mersey beat sound, a sound that would define an era. He was the innovator who used bongos and cowbells when other drummers were just keeping time. He, more than anyone, is responsible for that needles and pins sound, that chiming 12-string guitar riff that became a bolt of lightning, inspiring the Byrds, which in turn inspired Tom Petty, and which echoes to this day in thousands of folk rock and garage rock bands. And he was the man who, in a flash of paranoid genius, conceived the DNA for Deep Purple. But his life, his human story, is one of the most profound and terrifying cautionary tales in music history. He is the story of what happens when blinding raw talent is mixed with crippling, deep-seated insecurity. The boy named Crummy, who could never, ever believe he was good enough. He is the story of what happens when a man is torn apart by a profound spiritual conflict. The devout rebel, the Catholic choir boy who wanted to be a rock and roll sinner and who could not reconcile the two until it was too late. And he is the story of what happens when that fragile, brilliant mind is fed a relentless chemical diet of amphetamines, LSD, and the inhuman pressure of the pop machine, long before anyone understood the words mental health. He was the Mad Henry, who, unlike his Beatle rivals, had no stable internal structure, no fifth Beatle, like Brian Epstein or George Martin, to catch him when he inevitably fell. In the end, he was a rebel who found his only sanctuary in the absolute conformity of a tax office. He was a star who chose to vanish.